The silence before tragedy always feels heavier than thunder. It is the kind of silence that presses against the chest, warning of a truth too cruel to bear. In the dimness of that moment, hearts still cling to hope, even as the shadow of loss is already stretching its hand across the room. Henry sat in a world that felt frozen, though nothing around him was still. The fire crackled, logs shifted, a cold wind seeped through the cracks in the old stone walls, but none of it mattered. He had been waiting for news, clinging to the fragile thread of belief that Julia was safe. Days had passed in restless silence, his mind filling the void with memories of her laughter, her soft hand resting in his, the way her voice carried warmth even through the darkest hours. He told himself that love this strong could shield her from harm, that fate would not dare to tear her away. And yet, beneath his desperate faith, a quiet dread coiled in his chest, whispering the truth he refused to face. When the door finally creaked open, Henry's breath caught in his throat. He turned, expecting relief, expecting a familiar smile, or a messenger carrying a letter with words that would restore his hope. Instead, he found eyes that could not meet his own. Shoulders hunched, hands trembling, the bearer of news lingered at the threshold as though crossing into the room meant carrying a weight too heavy to speak aloud. Henry rose slowly, his legs weak with a fear that felt sharper than any blade. He asked the question without sound, his lips parting, his heart racing, but no voice escaping. The answer was written on the other man's face before the words were spoken, and in that silent instant Henry's world began to collapse. The truth fell with simple cruelty. Julia was gone. Gone from the earth, gone from the warmth of his arms, gone from the life they had promised each other. The words were delivered quietly, with a kind of pity, but Henry barely heard them. They echoed inside him like a cavern struck by a stone, reverberating through every part of him until he could not tell where the sound ended and his own soul began to crack. His chest tightened as if bound by iron, his breath stuttered, and a wave of disbelief crashed through him so fiercely that he stumbled back. He searched for air, for words, for anything to hold on to, but grief flooded in faster than he could resist. His mind betrayed him with flashes of Julia, her smile framed by sunlight, her laughter rising above the din of crowded halls, the promise in her eyes when she whispered that she would always return. Each memory now burned, no longer a comfort but a cruel reminder of all he had lost. He wanted to deny it, to demand proof, to rage at the injustice, but the weight of the messengers, silence, the sorrow in his eyes told Henry the truth needed no more evidence. His denial shattered in an instant, leaving him raw, exposed, and broken in the dim light of the room. The silence that followed was unbearable. The fire crackled on, indifferent to the grief consuming him. Time did not stop, though Henry wished it would. He felt as though the world should collapse with him, as though the skies themselves should weep for Julia's absence. Yet outside, life carried on, and the indifference of the world deepened his wound. He fell into a chair, his body trembling, his hands clawing at the air as though reaching for a presence that had already slipped beyond his grasp. The emptiness spread through him like a shadow with no end, and in that moment, Henry understood that nothing would ever be whole again. The news had landed like a blade, but the wound did not bleed in the way Henry expected. Instead, it hollowed him out, leaving a cold emptiness where his soul should have been. His body remained in the chair, but his spirit felt adrift, pulled away into a fog where nothing was steady, nothing was real. He blinked, trying to force the world into focus, yet everything blurred at the edges, as if even the room itself recoiled from sharing his grief. The fire that had once been a comfort now mocked him with its warmth, daring to exist when Julia did not. He stared into the flames, searching for her face, for her voice carried in the crackle of burning wood, but there was nothing, only silence, only absence. The messenger had stepped back, giving Henry space, though what Henry needed was not space at all, but the impossible, Julia's return. He clenched his hands into fists, nails biting into his palms, a desperate attempt to anchor himself in a reality he did not want. He wanted to rage, to cry out, to break every piece of furniture in the room until it matched the ruin inside him. But no sound came. His grief was not a storm but a slow drowning, each breath heavier, each heartbeat echoing the cruel truth that she was gone. He rose unsteadily, his knees buckling beneath him, and crossed the room like a man walking through water. Each step was weighted, sluggish, as though time itself conspired to drag him down. On the small wooden table lay Julia's ribbon, left behind days ago, its soft threads now carrying more meaning than the weight of the entire world. He picked it up with trembling fingers, and the texture of the fabric broke him in ways words never could. He pressed it to his lips, closing his eyes, begging silently that this was some nightmare, that he might wake and find her standing by the window, alive and smiling. But no awakening came. Reality was merciless. His mind wandered to the last moment they had spoken, her voice steady but tender, promising she would be safe, promising she would return. He had believed her because to believe otherwise was to invite despair. And now despair had come anyway, uninvited but absolute. Henry whispered her name into the empty room, but even the sound of it felt wrong without her there to answer. His words fell heavy, swallowed by the stone walls, and the silence that followed was more brutal than any reply. Tears finally burned his eyes, but they did not fall in gentle streams. They came harsh and hot, tearing through him as though his body could no longer contain the weight of his heartache. He clutched the ribbon tighter, holding it against his chest, as though pressing it into his skin might fuse her memory with his flesh. He feared forgetting even the smallest detail. The shade of her eyes in the morning light, the way her hand fit perfectly into his, the subtle tilt of her smile when she teased him. The thought of those memories fading with time was a terror. Almost as sharp as her death itself, the messenger shifted at the door, guilt and pity etched into his posture. But Henry did not acknowledge him. The world outside no longer existed. There was only Julia's absence and the echo of her presence, lingering like a ghost in every corner of the room. Henry sank to his knees, unable to stand beneath the weight pressing down on him. His hands shook as he clutched the ribbon, his forehead pressed against the cold wooden floor, his sobs breaking through at last. They tore from him raw and unrestrained. Not the dignified grief of a man, but the primal wail of someone who had lost the other half of his soul. The sound filled the room, bouncing from the walls, mingling with the fire's crackle until even the flames seemed to mourn with him. His cries grew softer, not because the pain had lessened, but because his body could no longer sustain the force of it. He sat there in silence again, shoulders slumped, face buried in his hands, as the truth settled deeper and deeper into his bones. Julia was gone, and the world would never be the same. But even in his ruin, a flicker of something darker sparked beneath the grief. A question, sharp and dangerous, whispered at the edges of his despair. Why had Julia been taken? And who was to blame for the hole ripped in his life? Grief twisted into a beginning of fury, and though he did not yet rise from the floor, his heart began to harden around that question. The pain had carved him hollow, but in that emptiness there was room for something else to take root. The silence was no longer only sorrow. It was also the quiet breath before a storm. The hours after the revelation bled into one another, a blur of shadows and half-heard sounds. Henry had not moved from the floor for what felt like an eternity. His hands were numb from gripping Julia's ribbon, his eyes swollen from tears that no longer fell. The fire had withered to glowing embers, faint breaths of light against the encroaching dark, and Henry felt himself reflecting those embers, burnt, diminished, but still carrying the faintest spark of something dangerous. He could not stop replaying the moment over and over in his mind, the words spoken, the hollow certainty in the messenger's voice, the way the room seemed to tilt as if it too recoiled from the truth. Each repetition deepened the wound, yet with each pass his sorrow began to shift. Pain sharpened into a blade, cutting through the fog of despair. His grief was no longer directionless, it was demanding answers. Julia had not simply vanished. Death, he thought, never arrived without reason. Behind every grave there was a hand that dug it, whether by fate, by cruelty, or by carelessness. He would not let her memory dissolve into the quiet forgetfulness of the world. He needed to know who had failed her, who had allowed her life to be stolen. And in that need, sorrow gave way to resolve. Henry staggered to his feet, his body aching, but his heart pounding with a new rhythm. He crossed the room and poured water from a jug, splashing it across his face, letting the chill bite into him and chase away the fog of despair. He stared into the basin, catching his reflection in the ripples. A man broken, eyes hollow, but not defeated. His grief had burned away the softness of who he had been. What looked back at him was harder, colder, edged with purpose. He remembered Julia's last words to him, her quiet promise that she would return. He had trusted her, and perhaps she had trusted that the world would keep her safe. But the world had betrayed them both. Now he felt the weight of that promise, not as comfort, but as a burden he was sworn to carry. She could no longer return, but he could not allow her death to vanish into silence. The thought of her slipping into history as nothing more than another lost soul filled him with rage so hot it threatened to consume what little calm he had left. He moved to the window, pulling it open to the night air. The wind swept in, sharp and cold, carrying with it the faint smell of rain. He stared into the darkness, and for the first time since the news, he spoke with strength. Her name left his lips not as a broken whisper, but as an oath. Julia. The word hung in the air, heavy, commanding. It was not a plea this time, it was a vow. The messenger, still lingering near the doorway, shifted uneasily. He had expected tears, perhaps silence, but not this sudden fire in Henry's voice. Henry turned toward him, eyes burning with something beyond grief. "Tell me," he demanded, his voice low but unyielding. "How did she die? Who was with her? Who failed? Her?" Each question struck like hammer blows, not only to the messenger, but to the stillness of the room itself. The man faltered, words caught in his throat, for he had delivered the news but not the story. Henry stepped closer, the distance between them charged with the force of his demand. "Do not hide it from me. If she is gone, then I will carry the truth of it, every detail, every reason. She deserves that. I deserve that." His voice cracked on the last word, grief still raw beneath the anger, but his eyes held steady. The messenger stammered fragments, a mention of sickness, of danger on the road, of circumstances that seemed to blur together. But Henry's mind clung to every fragment, weaving them into a thread of suspicion. Nothing about Julia's death could be accepted as simple, not when the loss carved so deeply. He would chase every rumor, question every witness, tear apart the world itself if that was what it took to find who had stolen her life. His fists clenched again, but not in despair this time. They tightened with resolve. He turned back to the fire, its dying glow reflecting in his eyes. "If fate has taken her, then fate will answer to me," he muttered, the words carrying more weight than any prayer. He no longer felt like a man, lost in sorrow, but a man remade by it, tempered in grief, sharpened by anger. The room seemed different now, charged with his vow. The silence was no longer suffocating, but waiting like the pause before a storm unleashes itself across the land. Henry felt it in his bones. His mourning was not finished, but it had transformed. He had moved beyond tears, beyond helplessness. Now there was only the fire of resolve, and the unshakable promise that Julia's death would not go unanswered. And in that promise, Henry's journey shifted. He was no longer a grieving man clutching at memories. He was a force being born, one whose path would carve itself in blood if it had to. The night deepened, swallowing the last glow of the hearth. Shadows stretched long across the stone floor, and Henry remained by the window, staring into the dark as though it might give him answers. His hands, still trembling, now felt steadier each time he gripped the ribbon in his palm. What had once been a relic of her softness now felt like a weapon and anchor binding him to the truth, and a reminder of the promise he was shaping within himself. For hours he did not speak, but his silence was no longer hollow. It was alive, filled with thought, with a storm turning quietly behind his eyes. The ache of Julia's absence remained sharp, but it no longer held him powerless. Instead, the pain had become something he carried with a strange pride, a scar he refused to hide. Her death was not the end of her presence, it was the beginning of his purpose. He thought of the life they had dreamed together, the future they had dared to whisper about in the stillness of the night. Julia had spoken of peace, of building something lasting, of finding a place where the world's cruelties could not reach them. That dream was now shattered, but in its broken pieces Henry found another vision forming: justice, or perhaps vengeance. If he could not give her the life she deserved, he would give her memory the honor of truth, the dignity of answers, and the fire of retribution. The messenger had left quietly, sensing Henry's solitude was no longer something to intrude upon. Alone now, Henry lit another candle and sat at the table. He drew parchment from the drawer, dipped his quill into ink, and began to write. His words were not steady at first. The tremor of grief still lived in his fingers, but with each line they grew stronger. He wrote Julia's name over and over, as though refusing to let the world erase her. He wrote every detail he could remember: her laugh, her voice, the tilt of her head when she teased him, the words of her last promise. And then he wrote a vow. It was not a vow to the gods, nor to the world, but to her alone. He swore he would not let her memory fade into silence. He swore he would find the truth of her death, no matter how deep it was buried. And he swore that whoever had allowed it, whoever had caused it, would pay with the weight of his grief. Each word carved the vow deeper into his soul, until it no longer felt like ink on parchment, but blood etched into the fabric of his being. When the candle finally guttered, Henry stood. His body was weary, but his spirit no longer sagged beneath the crushing weight of loss. He moved through the room with new certainty, gathering the few things that mattered: the ribbon, his father's blade, a flask of water, and the parchment he had filled with his vow. He tucked them carefully into his cloak, each item a piece of his new armor. He had no grand plan, no clear path forward, but he knew the first step. He would not remain here in a room haunted by absence. He would go into the world carrying Julia's memory like a torch, and he would not rest until the darkness trembled before it. Henry paused at the doorway, glancing once more at the fire. It had nearly died, only faint embers glowing in the ash. For a moment, he felt as though it mirrored his own transformation. The flames of his old self burned away, leaving something new forged in their place. He lifted a poker and stirred the ashes, watching sparks leap into the air. They were small, but they burned with defiance against the night. He whispered her name once more, this time not with despair, but with resolve. It was not a plea, not even an oath. It was a promise. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the scent of rain and earth. Henry stepped into the darkness, his cloak sweeping around him, his steps steady now. The night welcomed him not as a broken man, but as something more, a figure reborn from grief, carrying sorrow as both wound and weapon. Behind him, the room fell into silence, its story finished. Ahead of him, another story was waiting to be written, one marked not by Julia's death, but by what her absence would drive him to become. And in that silence of the world around him, Henry knew this: his pain would not fade, but neither would his purpose. Julia's name would be carried through fire and blood until the world itself remembered her. And in that vow, he was no longer only Henry, the man who had lost her. He was Henry, the man who would make her death mean something. The night closed around him, heavy and endless, but Henry walked into it without fear. The darkness no longer frightened him. It had already taken all it could. Now it would face what it had created.